Hi, this is Scott Garibay, and today I'm going to be talking about tabletop role-playing in design, and specifically the ethics of choosing whether or not to create a new tabletop role-playing game, and how a game designer's ethical choices can be informed by the work that has already been done on this question of whether to make a new project or not under code forking within software development. Okay? All right. So in software development, there is code forking, right? So basically you can fork a code base. And essentially this happens in software projects where the project is moving along and there becomes a point where there's a decision to fork the code. Okay, and that means copy the code base and then change it fundamentally so that there is a new path of development that is happening in parallel to, or in an angle that is quite askew from the original code base. So you have the original code base and you have the forked code base. Okay, and so basically what I'm saying is that when a tabletop role-playing game designer, which I'm going to refer to as a game designer going forward, when a game designer determines to, when a game designer decides to make a new tabletop role-playing game, the vast majority of the time, they are going to be creating a game fork. There's going to be the original game and now a fork game, a game that is running parallel on a different line of development than the original game. Okay. Now, now, first of all, and then basically I'm going to be answering the question of, what is an ethical choice? What is a good reason to game fork, to create a fork game, a forked game development path, rather than staying with the original game or allowing the original game to proceed without competition from your new game, right? So that's what I'm really talking about today. All right. Now, just to be clear, if you're a game designer and you have a game that has a new rule system and a new world, okay, and new rule system, new world, new genre. All three of those are new. This does not apply to you, right? You can just proceed fully blessed. All right, and the reason why is those are, in my opinion, fully ethical choices, right? Those in my opinion always, unless the content is really, really questionable, at the macro level, those always benefit the tabletop role-playing game community. Also, let's talk about the tabletop role-playing game community. So I talked about an ethical choice. Is creating a new game fork, a new game, right? Forking off from an original game, is it an ethical choice, right? Are you making an ethical choice? Well, so ethics is right or wrong within a preset, arbitrary set of rules that you have agreed to follow, right? Or that you are simply that you are bound by because of choices you've made, right? Whether that be where you live or things like that, your choices put you in a position to be under an ethical framework, okay? Now, morality is different. Morality is right or wrong at the level of all humanity, right? This is right or wrong at the level of humanity, right? We're talking about ethics today rather than morality. These are not, making a new tabletop role-playing game does not reach the level of a morality question generally. I'm not talking about extreme content. Of course, you would get into a moral issue. But if you're making just content that would be accessible by most adults, we're talking about an ethical choice rather than a moral choice. Okay. All right. So how does this work, right? So one, I want to talk a little bit about software project forking. Okay. So basically, software projects are forked. When software projects are forked, they have specific goals. Those goals fall into two groupings: product level goals and community level goals. And you can fork a software project for either reason. Okay. If you do a product level, excuse me, fork, generally what you're doing is you're looking for protection against the following things: planned obsolescence, versioning, okay, vendor lock-in, and decay, right? Basically, and then if you're doing it at the community level, you would be looking for protection against project leaders or owners of the original software, against, you know, decisions that you think that they are making that is going to hurt that code base, that software project, right? And then finally, on the community level, it can be forked in order to revive a project, right? Because maybe a project needs to be revived. Decay has set all the way in; it is fully decayed, and it needs to be revived. Those are all reasons. Those are all forking goals, right? Goals for forking, right? Now, let's talk a little bit about what is a bad motivation to fork. So let's go back to tabletop role-playing games. What is a bad motivation, a bad ethical choice, a bad ethical reason to fork a game? Well, the biggest, one of them is if you want to file the name off of the original owner and put your name in as the owner. So basically, you've taken this entire game, everything's the same. The only thing that's really, and what you've done is you've just changed the names, right? But it's really, it's virtually the same world, and the difference is 5 or 10% that you think is important, but many, even if it's 5 or 10% different and you think those differences are important, to me that's such a minimal difference, right? That if your goal is to file off the original owner's name and present your name as the new owner, as the new creator, file off the original creator's name, and now you're presenting yourself as the new as the creator, right? That is a bad ethical reason to fork a game, a tabletop role-playing game, okay? Now, what is a good reason to fork a tabletop role-playing game? There is a good reason to fork a tabletop role-playing game. Innovation. If you are innovating the world significantly, if you are innovating the rules significantly, if you are innovating the genre significantly, that is a very good ethical reason to fork a game, right? And I think you can go right ahead, right? What is a questionable reason questionable ethical reason to fork a tabletop role-playing games? In order to improve or replace it, right? Again, if you have and well, we're gonna get to examples in a minute. If you're like, oh, I think they got longbows wrong in this, and 4 other weapons have the wrong damage value or the wrong range, and you create a new game just to fix those small picayune differences that matter to you, that is a very questionable reason to fork a game. And one of the things I want to point out at this point is when you fork a game, right? You could be, and I'm assuming that you legally do it. You do it legally so that no laws are broken, right? I'm not talking about people breaking the law here. I'm talking about legal forks, right? You can clone a game. If you give all the characters new names, if you give it new art and you give it a new title, generally you're going to be fine, right? Because you can't even patent rules, right? So basically that's one of the issues here is, basically, if you're just doing it to improve the game marginally, that's really questionable. And if you're doing to replace it, right, again, that's very questionable. Is there a good reason to replace it, right? And I think generally there aren't good reasons to replace it. And we as game designers, we have to remember, okay, this other game has been created by this creator. I have my energy and my passion, and now I want to use that to create a new tabletop role-playing game. Well, if you fork a game, and now your game is 5 or 10% different, or even 15% different, let's say it's even 15% better than the other game, right? What's going to happen is your game isn't going to have as large a following as it could, because, and the reason why is because it's sitting, there are a lot of players still sitting with the original game, and the original game's growth is going to be stifled by all these players coming over to play your game, right? And so, this is if you have a chicken joint, if you have a chicken restaurant in a town, right, and somebody wants to put up a chicken restaurant 1 block away, it's not really beneficial to that town. And that store owner really needs to think twice whether this is beneficial to that community. Same thing here, right? You can make a choice that is completely legal, but is not ethical. And I'm talking about ethical choices in whether you should create the game you want to create or not, right? Now, I am fully aware that there are many game designers who are going to listen to this and say, I only care about me, or I only care about me and my community corner, the small corner of the community that follows my games, right? And I'm right here calling you to a higher standard and saying you should think about the tabletop role-playing game community at the macro level, And so once you do that, when you're thinking about the tabletop role-playing game community at the macro level, right, then that says you should be really thinking about this as an ethical choice. Would you be better off spending your time creating a game that has new genre, new world, new rules, right? And my argument is yes, you would, right? You might be passionate about this other, game fork that you're doing, but it doesn't help the tabletop role-playing game community as a whole. And I think we really do suffer with this right now, where it can be hard to put together a table for many games because there are so many games. And one of the reasons why we have this is we don't have game designers who are saying, is this an ethical choice for me to fork this game, right? Now, I think a lot of people might think, oh, hey, Scott, I think you're kind of like stretching your analogy here, right? Well, I really thought about this, and one of the reasons why I took the time to actually talk about this was when I thought about tabletop role-playing game forks from the thinking of them from this perspective of software project forks. It like every single example of software project forks, immediately there were games that came to mind that fit like where you would see, right? And so I'll share those with you now. So let's talk about forking reasons, right? What are reasons that software projects have been forked, right, at the macro level? This isn't just one or two, but many, right? And are there examples in the tabletop role-playing game community where we have seen that happen, right? Well, the answer is yes. All right, so let's get into them. What's some of these forking reasons to fork a software project where we can see direct examples in the tabletop role-playing game community? Excuse me. All right, so here we go. The first one is essentially is a technical direction, right? So technical direction is when a project is forked because a group wants to go in a different technical direction, right? I'll give a perfect example of this for in tabletop role-playing games. All right, so perfect example of this is 5e from 4e. So 4e was very tactical. It was very strategy-based. Dungeons & Dragons, 4e, Dungeons & Dragons. And it was really set up just like an MMORPG. It really was, right? And then 5e was like, no, we need to go back to the narrative roots. We need to make the game simpler, and we need to make it more accessible to creative and artistic types, not just intellectual types, right? Who would be interested in tactics and strategy. That's a completely different technical direction. So 5e was forked from. By the way, what are tabletop role-playing game forks? What constitutes one? Well, a version definitely constitutes a fork, right? A version is a fork. In it now, that's not the same in tabletop in software. So a new version of software is not a fork. It is my opinion that in the tabletop role-playing game industry, new versions are forks. Okay, all right. So that there's a little bit of a difference there, right? It's subtle, but it's important. Okay, what are some other reasons? Well, one of them is a personality clash. As soon as I heard that, right, like that absolutely happens on software projects, right? Well, it happens in tabletop role-playing games too. It is my opinion that Numenera is a personality clash fork of Dungeons & Dragons. Monty Cook of Monty Cook Games worked on 5th edition, was working on 5th edition, quit 5th edition, and then bing, like, exactly the amount of time it would take to develop a new game, he comes out with Numenera, which looks exactly like Dungeons & Dragons, just set in the future, with science called magic, and with a completely new rule system. So in my opinion, Numenera is actually a fork of Dungeons & Dragons 4e, right? Done specifically for personality clash reasons. That is fascinating, right? What else in there? Groups. So one of the reasons why software projects are forked is a group feels that they're not being heard. There's absolutely a tabletop role-playing game that fits this definition, and that is Overlight. So Overlight, in my opinion, is really a decolonized Dungeons & Dragons. It is a Dungeons & Dragons that has completely abandoned any kind of British history, medieval history, and has abandoned Tolkien, right? Because Tolkien is... Dungeons & Dragons is absolutely marinated in Tolkien, right? Nothing wrong with that. But there are people who are saying, hey, I want a Dungeons & Dragons. I want a fantasy tabletop role-playing game. I really want Dungeons & Dragons without the colonial influences. And that really is Overlight. Overlight by Renegade Games is absolutely fits this model. Another one is commercial. A commercial reason is not saying, well, commercial reason is not saying I want to file your name off and replace with my name. It's just saying, hey, I have a tabletop role-playing game company too, and we need to survive as well, right? And so I think a perfect example of a commercial fork of Dungeons & Dragons, and by the way, that's the game that's forked the most, by far, right? Is a perfect example of a commercial fork of Dungeons & Dragons is Fantasy Age by Green Ronin. Right? Fantasy Age is virtually identical to Dungeons & Dragons, but the reason why it was forked is just so Green Ronin would be able to continue with a lot of their other projects. Now that's another thing, is they didn't do it. That's another reason why I'm not crying foul and saying that was a bad ethical decision. And the reason why is they are making other games. That is a commercial decision. They needed a fantasy game in order to drive sales and keep their company afloat. But they are making new and exciting games that really do help the tabletop role-playing game industry, the tabletop role-playing game community, right? They're genuinely helpful. What is a legal reason why? And that's another reason that that is another specific reason that that software projects are forked. There's absolutely an example of a legal fork. So a legal fork of Dungeons & Dragons is Dave Arneson's Blackmoor. It's made by Zeitgeist Games, and it's a freestanding world, and it really was broken off because Dave Arneson had significant legal troubles with TSR. So that exists that's a fork that was done for legal reasons. Now, when you think about this forking, right? Forking has results. There are certain things that can happen when a software project is forked, right? So let's talk about them. Let's talk about a few of these, right? So what are the different things that can happen? And then I will give you some examples. The first one that can happen is, so basically when you fork a software project, and when you fork a tabletop role-playing game, the original can live and the fork can live. What's an example of that? Really easy one. Dungeons & Dragons and Pathfinder. That's an example of where the original lived and the fork lived, okay? Next is, what about when a fork dies, right? When the original lives and the fork dies. Specifically, that one, to see an example of that, you have to look at Champions and Marvel Supers, right? So Champions is still around, and you can still buy Champions, and there are people who still play Champions. And I think Champions actually may be on the rise now, and the reason why is the Marvel superhero game is 100% dead. It is currently not available for print anywhere, and there are no plans by Marvel to reestablish a new Marvel Super tabletop role-playing game. So that's an example where the original lived and the fork died. Okay, what about an example where the original dies and the fork lives? Right, an example of that would be Gamma World. So Gamma World 1E has virtually no players left, but Gamma World 4E, right, which was a massive fork, a real, genuine fork, right? And when we talk about that, there were cards in that game. It worked in a way that no Gamma World game had ever worked before. It's the world itself was slightly different. The rules were different. Literally, the game mechanics were different. And I would argue that Gamma World 1E has really died, and Gamma World 4E is quite alive. There's some really robust games of that going on to this day, and I see that at FLGS's friendly local game shops. I actually see examples of that game still. I see that game still being played. What about a situation where the original dies and the fork dies, right? Well, here's an example of that. Game of Thrones, right? There is a Game of Thrones 1E, which was created by Guardians of Order. I think it was a Canadian company. That game is dead, right? There was a fork of that game called The Song of Ice and Fire. It's made right. It is actually for sale right now by Green Ronin. But I say that game is dead, even though it's in print. And the reason why is virtually no one plays it. And the reason for that is there's a very specific reason for that. And that is, what is the reason why what is the reason why I say Game of Thrones, the current Song of Ice and Fire made by Green Ronin Plus and being sold by Green Ronin Plus right now? Well, they made it just like Dungeons & Dragons. It's like, oh, play your character, you have one character, and it runs just like Dungeons & Dragons, right? Where you have a player character, every player has a player character, and the game master runs the game like Dungeons & Dragons. But the reality is, the Game of Thrones is the Game of Thrones. Like one dude cutting down a soldier somewhere, it doesn't matter in the Game of Thrones, and that's the way the game is actually structured. There's really no mechanics in that game to deal with decades or with years or even a decade passing, to deal with the quick jump forwards in time, and to deal with the political aspects of it. It's really just Dungeons & Dragons trying to be Game of Thrones, in my opinion, very unsuccessfully. And that game really has not caught on fire. If you know people are playing that, let me know, but I never see that game played in any FLGSs. The last example is, what about when a fork what about when a game when a fork merges back into the original? This is incredibly rare, but it has happened in tabletop role-playing games. So Oriental Adventures came out in 1985, Dungeons & Dragons Oriental Adventures. In 1997, John Wick brought out Legends of the Five Rings. In 2002, Rokugan, the setting of Legends of the Five Rings, became Dungeons & Dragons Oriental Adventures official setting. That is a fork merging back into the original. That's my thoughts on forks, on tabletop role-playing game forking, and how to use the lessons learned in software project forking to see if your choice to create a new tabletop role-playing game is an ethical choice. Does it aid the tabletop role-playing game community at the macro level, right? And that's the same ethics that software projects use. Is forking this project going to aid the community that this software serves? Is it going to benefit them, right? So that's my thoughts. I would love to hear your thoughts on this topic. Let me know in the comments below. Please consider liking and subscribing, and have a wonderful millennium.